The year of learning had three sort of big themes, and this is, of course, our last quarter, sort of the culmination of everything. The first theme in the fall quarter was advancing the art and science of teaching and learning. And we really kind of were taking stock of what's happening in Stanford and beyond, and really appreciate all sorts of different forms of teaching. Then in the winter quarter, we moved to the changing ecology and demography of higher education. And now in this quarter, we're in the future of higher education in this changing landscape. And we've had many events and things to talk about all year long, but two of the things I just want to point out that made it directly from the Year of Learning program into the Learning Summit are the sessions on formal and informal learning, and also on lifelong learning, learning across the lifespan. And of course, there's many other things that are happening today. I will come back later to tell you a little bit about logistics. I'm going to hand it over to Vice Provost Junn Mitchell to tell you a little bit about our first plenary session. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. I thought I'd say a few words about the structure of the program today, just to give you an orientation around that. I guess if there's one theme at this point, it's basically that although the technology and MOOCs kicked off one sort of set of thoughts about innovation, there were other trends already underway and other people thinking about changing the undergraduate experience and redesigning the activities that our students are involved with. And so at this point, I think we're looking at bringing both of those thought processes and threads together in some meaningful way. So a lot of what we have on the program ties in with innovation and changes and needs in residential learning with some of the ideas that came along with technology and its possible disruption of our daily lives and the field and activities we know and love. We, at some point in planning this program, hit along three words that I think alliterate but probably need a little bit of explanation. So we decided to structure this in terms of policy, pedagogy, and porosity. So I thought I'd say just a minute about what those meant to us at the time we chose them, so that you can kind of get oriented to the different breakout sessions and choose where you're going. Policy here generally refers to changes in the structure of our institutions, partnerships between campuses and external providers, and things that have to do with changing credentials, changing programs, things that might be beyond the undergraduate and graduate programs that we now have, but would be structured in different ways. Pedagogy, I think, is hopefully a familiar topic for many of you. So what are we learning about learning? Where are we in the last couple of years? And what are important trends going forward? Porosity, I think, came to the fore in the edX meeting last fall. I thought this was a really nice term. It had to do with the availability of our activities on campus to people who are not on campus, kind of breaking down or in some way transforming the border between the campus and people who are not enrolled in some way. So this ties at Stanford here into a process we had led by the D School. They came up with, at the result of a year, a student-centered process around what the University of the Future might look like. One of their outcomes was something they called the open loop university. Being students, they had a kind of idealistic view of how the university worked. They had this idea that you would get something like a meal card, and it would have a certain number of quarters or semesters on it. And you could come to campus anytime you wanted and have a few of those quarters punched off. Somebody would give you a towel and a dorm room key, and you could take a few, a year of classes. And then when you wanted to start your first startup and make your first, I think million is the wrong word now. First, $500 million. Then you would go do that, and then you come back and have a few other things punched a little bit later. But that's kind of the idea behind porosity. Come and go, and we're here, and how do we help people learn throughout their lives, and as faculty, I guess my view is, how do I learn from them throughout their lives, because that's really what we do in the university. So that's the thought around the plan for the day. So now let me turn to the panel that we'll start with this morning. So I'm grateful to all of you who flew in from other places. And what we've tried to do in the program, in a sense, is give you a little bit of a taste of California. So we gave you our governor last night, at great length. I thought he was going to... I didn't mean to be funny. I thought he was going to come in, say a few words, leave, but he sat down and had his salad, and I mean, had a good long conversation with him, and I thought that was fascinating. Today, he mentioned the master plan, and today in our panel, we have that represented here with a few wild cards. So let's go for I thought Randy Bass from Georgetown does not represent a preconceived portion of the master plan, but any plan should evolve and be open. So let me just say, introduce the panelists, and then we'll proceed from there. I'll give them a little bit of time to each make a kind of an opening statement. Then we'll have a discussion among the panel, and then questions from the floor. We have one microphone that it would be helpful if we could use, so this gives you a chance to come out and stand up and ask questions over this. So first, Randy Bass is Vice Provost for Education and Professor of English at Georgetown, where he leads the Designing the Futures initiative and the Red House Incubator for Curricular Transformation. Saxenian is next on my list, but one over there, as Dean and Professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley and Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning. She's written books on a number of different topics. One, among the more recent, about circulation of immigrant engineers between Silicon Valley and their entrepreneurship communities emerging in China, India, Taiwan, and Israel. Ellen Junn, to her left, your right, is Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at CSU Dominguez Hills, previously Provost at San Jose State during the period of some exciting MOOC experiments with edX and Udacity. Her research interests and publications include college teaching effectiveness, faculty development, educational equity and diversity issues, early child education, and advocacy. Brian Murphy on the end is president of DeAnza College in Cupertino, California. He was instrumental in the development of the Democracy Commitment, a national project aimed at ensuring that every community college student has an education in democratic practice. During the late 1980s, he served as chief consultant to the California State Legislature's review of the Master Plan for Higher Education. Dan Schwartz, last alphabetically, but second to my left here, is Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Stanford and an expert in human cognition and educational technology. So let me sit down and start here to my left with Randy. What do you see happening at your institution? What do you think you would like to see personally in higher education? And what do you think will happen at Georgetown, and how will you achieve that in the next few years?
You have 5 minutes.
You can answer whichever part of that you want.
Okay.
Right? We're just trying to have fun.
I'll answer the part of that I prepared. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I teach at a school that's both Catholic and Jesuit. So the idea that I may or may not be part of some preconceived master plan raises important theological issues for me. So I have to think about those later in the morning.
I have to let you know, just that there's a little more in those comments than you might think for those who were here and heard about Jerry Brown's educational history and study to be a Jesuit priest.
Fascinating.
But you're in line with that. So I'm sorry, Randy came in late last night.
So at Georgetown, I do spend a lot of my time leading this curriculum initiative that's asking the question, what do we think a Georgetown education might look like in 5, 10, 15 years? And for me, the crux of that question is really, how will we be able to afford to be us in 2025 or 2030? How will we be able to live out our deepest values and our highest aspirations in a world with this burgeoning digital global learning ecosystem, as we need to do more and more of the most expensive part of our model and are likely to do less of the least expensive part of our model. So to me, the work that we're doing is trying to develop a more agile, flexible model with greater variation and more structural diversity. And to do that without losing the core of our value or the core of the product that we believe that we deliver. So to me, this is really a version of this that almost every institution in the country is grappling with. And I see it as a clash of two learning paradigms that is really, to me, the greatest tension of this moment. On the one hand, we have what I think of as the disintegrative learning paradigm or the disaggregative paradigm, and that's granular learning, modularized learning, learning decoupled from formal boundaries, analytics-driven learning, certain forms of competency-based learning, et cetera. All excellent, important innovations, but fundamentally disintegrative of what we think learning is. Then there's the integrative version of learning, which is that learning is a journey, learning is greater than the sum of the parts, learning is curriculum and co-curriculum, learning is about the whole person, it's about knowledge, skills, and wider sense of dispositions. I think these two paradigms now have emerged as sort of two narratives about the future of higher education. One is the unbundling narrative that we've been living for the last few years. The other is, has been cast as the broken, bundled model. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of venture capital pouring into the disintegrative space, hundreds of dollars pouring into the integrative space. So, and this really, I think, resonates with very much what you said, John, in your remarks about kind of moving to this next phase. I think where we're at is really, we need to be thinking now in a kind of new synthesis, what I and my collaborator, Brett Einen, have been calling a rebundling. And it really is just simply, this is now the moment where we have to be thinking, how do we put these incredible emerging disintegrative capabilities in service of an integrative vision? So I think that that will play out in a whole bunch of ways, which we can talk about as we go along, and I think it resonates with almost every theme of the rest of today. I'll just mention 4 really quickly. I think it resonates with the theme of formal and informal learning, in that we can be thinking, how can we be creating new opportunities for students to connect the different and disparate parts of their learning? Co-curriculum, curriculum, what happens in the classroom, what happens outside the classroom, what happens over time. I think it connects to the future of academic credentials, that if we're interested in alternative degrees and alternative credentials and stackable credentials, what is it that's holding those together? Or in what ways are we reconceptualizing how students, continue to develop as they work through those stackable credentials? It connects to the responsible use of student data, to be asking how are we using data not just to watch student behavior and intervene in their behalf, but actually put data in the hands of students and empower them and help them learn how to have real digital fluency, real digital agency by understanding how to work with their own data. And I think it, of course, connects to inclusive digital pedagogies and digital environments. Not asking how can we use adaptive tools or intelligent tutors to run more students through stats, but how are we now able to get a much wider range of students to engage in true inquiry using quantitative and statistical tools. So my hope for higher education, which is one of the things you posed.
Where are we going? How are we going to get there?
Is, well, I'm out of time. Is just that we have the capacity, or the beginnings of the capacity, to help all students, including the new demographics, to develop a life of purpose, and a life that, and through an education that's really built around the whole person. And unless our sense of innovation is not being driven by a fundamentally integrative vision, then I'm not sure that the innovation itself will help us accomplish that.
Great, thank you. Dan, how are things here? What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, I'm going to, as always, John, slightly ignore your question. So there's a burgeoning field called the science of learning. This goes from like neuroscience to the temporal dynamics of learning to things like the social basis of mathematical concepts. There's been a huge investment in this. The National Science Foundation put in roughly a quarter to a third of $1 billion for science of learning centers. At one point, I was the director of a center that studied informal and formal education. And so this field has generated a lot of findings that are relevant to instruction. Let me give a few examples that may or may not be surprising to you. If you would like to increase people's abilities to apply their knowledge, it's better to give them 2 examples than to give them 1 example plus the principle. Right? So, which 1 example plus the principle is what we do in all our classes. Telling people how to solve a problem before they engage in problem solving oftentimes interferes with their learning. So flipped instruction may have some backfires to it. People spend more time to learn on behalf of teaching another than they will spend on themselves. Rewarding people for an activity they already enjoy reduces their motivation for that activity. And then constructive criticism that simply says, I gave you this criticism because I believe you can do the best, nearly doubles students' rate of revision. So there's many, many more of these, right? And the explanations of these effects contribute to the basic science, but here I'm more interested in the practical problem, which is why does college instruction and online instruction fail to incorporate these insights? And so there's the usual list of reasons, the wrong incentive structures for faculty. It's too hard to incorporate. So edX, it was kind of tough to make it do what I want. And online platforms don't have the infrastructure to support anything new. But I think there's a simpler reason, and that is that people don't know about them, that there's a translation problem. The educational and the psychological literature is very hard to penetrate. If you did a search on the word identity, you would get lost. And so the fact that people don't know about it is exacerbated by the second problem, is the fact that everyone believes they're an expert in education because they went to school. Right, and that's like me saying I'm an expert in physics because I've lived in a physical world, right? It's a mistake. And there really is a body of science that goes beyond people's intuitions. So how do we solve this problem? I think MOOCs, as originally conceptualized, brought one of the worst models of instruction through history to scale. And it was very, very efficient at it. But you know, that always happens. And it generated a tremendous amount of interest in technology and learning. And so I think we can take advantage of that. Currently, most efforts at college instruction don't have the benefits of close relations with experts in learning research. And I think this limits the creativity of the design and also the opportunity to learn more about how people learn. The centers that serve the faculty, they have a great deal of expertise, but they're kind of organized as service centers, right? And as service centers, they're not bringing the research faculty in who can help bring the state of the art and design research to find out more about what works. So my current goal, John, is to add a research and learning arm to your teaching and online center. I think these centers, it would be a great synergy. I think there's a lot of creativity possible. And I think doing this would benefit both the instruction and the research. So I suppose my final thought or question to you is, are there any donors in the audience?
So you can see that Dan and I are using these public events to become better friends. I think I'm just going to broaden the question. Anna, what would you like to say?
First, I want to say that I'm honored to be here alongside colleagues from Georgetown and Stanford, and especially alongside my colleagues in the California Master Plan, Ellen and Brian. It's really nice to have us together representing the 3 tiers in the system. I think I was initially asked many weeks, months ago, to talk about the challenges facing my institution. Well, Berkeley is, as you know, a very big public university known for academic excellence and broad accessibility. And I think nobody would argue with the statement that our biggest challenge right now is financial. To build a sustainable financial model for a new fiscal era with radically reduced state support for our mission without sacrificing excellence and access. As many of you know, state funding has dropped from 40% of our budget to around 10% recently. And given the public control over our system, our options for raising revenue have been radically constrained. And we are continuing to face regular budget cuts and a rising budget deficit. So what I want to do is talk about the experience just of the one school that I know the best, the School of Information, where I'm the dean, as a way to talk about policy, pedagogy, and porosity, and also one possible way that we might address some of the financial challenges that we face. The iSchool is the newest school on the Berkeley campus, home to cross-disciplinary research and teaching on the organization, management, and use of information or data in a world of globally distributed networks and pervasive and mobile computation. We have a very small, like a dozen faculty, but they're very distinguished, and they are from fields ranging from computer science to social science to law to the humanities. And I'm quite proud that 2 of our faculty are on the program today. When I started as dean about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we had 2 flourishing small programs. One was a master's in information management with about 100 students and an even smaller doctoral program, about 20 students. We were incredibly successful at what we did. We graduated master's students who got very desirable, high-paying jobs in Silicon Valley companies. Our doctoral students went and got teaching jobs in other universities. All was good, but there was no path to growth. And frankly, given that we were facing budget cuts almost every year, it wasn't even clear that we were going to survive, that we could sustain ourselves. So I think I realized earlier on than many of my colleagues that we would not be able to, we could not count on the state or the central campus funds to support what we did. And we started to think about revenue generation. About 5 years ago, we had a faculty retreat where we talked about what were the needs, how could we start to broaden what we did and maybe generate some revenue at the same time. And we agreed that, we agreed that there was an emerging need for professional education in what was then very little talked about, but in data science. That was before the big hype around big data. And we talked about, well, we could make money doing executive education, or we could do another professional master's degree. And with only 12 faculty and minimal staff, the idea of executive education was a little bit out of our comfort zone. So we focused on a self-supporting master's degree. A self-supporting degree at Berkeley means that unlike our other degrees where there's no connection between what we do and the revenues that we generate, in a self-supporting degree, we can actually get a large share of the revenues that we generate. And since we had already started to outgrow the building that housed us, and space on campus was, of course, scarce, we decided, well, we're the School of Information, let's go online. So it was kind of an experiment in a new field and in a new mode of education. So flash forward 6 years, or 5 years, I'm not going to take you through the gory details, but we've built what I consider to be a very successful online Masters of Information and Data Science. We have already 300 students enrolled from all over the world. Our admission standards, and we're expecting to grow it, to be about 500 students in the coming year. Our admission standards are more exacting than those for our campus program, and our student body is every bit as strong as those in our face-to-face program, albeit a bit older. Virtually all of the students are working professionals, so they're in their mid-30s, even 40s, rather than their mid-20s. We've graduated 50 students so far, and they are also all getting jobs. They're either getting promoted in their same jobs or moved into new jobs, better salaries, better positions. I think it's been an overall stunning success. And from my point of view, most importantly, we've generated sufficient revenues that in the most recent round of budget cuts this year, we have not really had any problems. We're basically now as close to self-sustaining as I think we can be on the Berkeley campus. So the question is, how did a really teeny, unknown school manage to launch and scale such a successful program so quickly? Again, there are many, many gory details that I won't even start to share, but I just have 3 lessons. One is about policy, one is about pedagogy, and one is about porosity. So policy, on this point, I think we have benefited from the value of partnership. The only way we're able to build and get a program to market quickly, as well as to scale it successfully, was through a partnership with an external vendor. This is not something that was well liked by many of my colleagues on the Berkeley campus, but it's a principle that Silicon Valley companies learned a long time ago, that when you're in a very fast-paced and competitive environment, rather than trying to do everything yourself, it's best to specialize in what you do best and then partner with other specialists who excel at what they do well. Both parties can therefore innovate and move more quickly as a result. So the vendor we chose had a strong track record in launching and growing online master's degrees. They had a high-touch, high-interaction model of teaching that appealed to us. They were willing to invest very heavily in the upfront cost of developing the curriculum, and they took up all of the front-end financial risk of starting and launching a new program. They also understood, I came to learn this only later, that online education done well is not really a technology business. It's not about the technology. It's a service, it's an educational service. And it requires high levels of staffing to support both the students and the faculty, as well as to ensure operational success. So they provided their interactive platform, 24/7 tech support, very sophisticated marketing capabilities, which are hard to come by in universities these days. And this allowed my faculty to focus entirely on what we do well, designing courses, designing an end-to-end curriculum where the courses added up to more than the sum of their parts, teaching the courses. We also control all admissions, all degree granting, and all of the IP that goes into it. Of course, we gave up a sizable share of revenue in order to do this to the vendor, but the value they've provided has been huge. I don't think we would have a program today if we didn't have this partnership. So I think the moral of this story in terms of policy is universities need to get over their NIH, they're not invented here syndrome. We should do what we do best and find others who have complementary expertise that we can partner with. Second, on pedagogy, the story here is that I believe it's possible to have a very high-quality online education program that mimics what happens, at least in our best campus graduate programs, and this is not an undergraduate program. I think there are many other issues at stake, but in a graduate professional program, you can develop a very high level of a high-quality educational service that doesn't sacrifice integration of the curriculum. Our students are required to show up once a week for every course they take for an hour and a half synchronous sessions in which there are 15 students and 1 faculty member. That means they get to know each other very well. They get to know the faculty member very well. They create a community. It's very high touch, high interaction. The students can use the platform to do team projects together. So many of our courses require teams of 3 to 5 students to do projects, whether it's a project in how to storing and retrieving data or data visualization. They do a synthetic capstone project, which they do in teams. All of this can be accomplished with the existing technology today. They are connected 24/7 on multiple Slack channels that serve as forums for joint problem solving, for mutual support. I'm not allowed on most of them, but they have convinced us to pay for it because they believe it's critical to their education. And they've really created very strong social networks. For example, there are self-organized local meetups of mid-students in Chicago, in the South Bay, in San Francisco, in New York. And they come to Berkeley once a year. They're required to come to Berkeley at least once for a week-long immersion where they meet our faculty face-to-face and they get to play with the Oski Bear and go to a ball game and really become part of the campus. And most of them actually select to come to graduation when they graduate, which is also a really nice thing. And then finally, porosity. Well, the demand for education by mid-career professionals is huge. We've tapped into a very, very large market of people who work full-time but cannot come and live in Berkeley for 2 years to get a master's degree. But they're willing to work hard, often on top of a full-time job and a family, to pursue an education in new areas. As I said before, it's not the same population as our face-to-face students. We're usually single and willing to live on campus and take advantage of that environment. Most of them also have substantial career experience, which complements and actually enriches the graduate education process. They learn, as usual, they learn from one another as much as they learn from us. So the age of we have students age 25 and age 65, good range. And I think, we have 3 applications. There are many things that have gone along with this that are contrary to what we do at Berkeley. 3 admission cycles a year, it's kind of continuous. We're teaching all summer, the faculty don't like that. Our admission staff is overwhelmed all the time. But yet we also have maintained our standards. We admit about 20% of the applicants that we get every semester. 91% of our students are expected to graduate on time, and the attrition rate to date has been 4%. So I think this is one small piece of a solution to some of the financial problems that a place like Berkeley suggests, which is we can start to extend our education outside of the borders to a different demographic. We can partner with other institutions that know how to do some of the things very well that we can't do, and we can generate revenue that will sustain our core mission and allow us to excel and also provide access. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to comment on something that people raise here, and I'll come back to this. Let's say I mean this in the nicest possible way. One of the things I liked about the governor's long description yesterday was his attribution of portion of his success to being named after his father.
Yes.
And I thought that was very enlightening in some way and truthful. I like the way you've attributed your success to the partnership, to the use of good pedagogy, and the way you reach different audiences and people at later stages in their life. But I also can't help thinking part of the success is that you're named the School of Information, which is probably not a hard thing to market these days.
I think that.
And so maybe we'll come back to what would work in a broader context.
Can I just say one quick thing? Yeah. I think it's not the School of Information. People don't know what a School of Information is like. We call ourselves the iSchool, and most people say, oh, iSchool. It's the Berkeley name that
I also think being as a master's in data science is probably not the hardest thing to sell.
I have to agree with that, but I think there are many examples of professional degrees. You can think of professional degrees in many fields that could sell. But you're right, data science and Berkeley are pretty magical.
So when we get to medieval manuscripts at that scale, then
I don't think I'd go there.
Ellen, how are things down south? As my grandmother from Pasadena used to say.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to also echo my colleague here who also said that it's wonderful to have more diversity in the audience and on the panel in terms of having public institutions at all 3 levels, community college, UC, and the CSU. So I represent the California State University system. And I think it's especially important because if we think about what the President Obama, as well as the Lumina Foundation, has been setting as goals for America's college attainment rate, the vast majority of students who graduate on and get undergraduate degrees are not going to be necessarily coming proportionally from the institutions represented by the audience members here, the elite august institutions, but rather from the state institutions all across this country. So I'm especially pleased and honored, as Anne says, to be here among you today. And what I wanted to do in my 5-minute period of time here is to talk a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities that we have with the students who do represent enormous diversity, particularly, specifically here in California, but nationally as well. So the first thing you should know, as John told you, is I was the provost at San Jose State about 2.5 years ago, and we were embroiled in the most infamous MOOC media frenzy that probably we haven't seen in quite some time. And I'm delighted to say I've survived it, still standing, moving strong. And the great thing about that particular intervention is twofold. Number one, I wanted to publicly congratulate and thank and show my gratefulness to the elite institutions of this nation who ventured out to offer the possibility of the MOOC through a knot. I see him sitting in the back with edX, MIT and Harvard edX, and then Stanford with the efforts that went through with Coursera, Daphne, and then Udacity as well with Sebastian. And the reason why I want to say that publicly is because prior to that time, the elite institutions were not talking at a national level about the urgency about teaching, right? Because MOOCs have to do with the pedagogy. But what I would also say, and I'll say this in a little bit in my comments in a moment, is that the focus on teaching was, I thought, critical to start turning the tide in American discourse about what is higher education all about. But what I will at the same time say that focusing simply on the teaching aspect is really, in some sense, it's the other side of the coin, but it's the important sort of, It's the pragmatic part of the higher ed, but it is not the value added piece. The value added piece of higher ed is the learning. And I point you to an article that was written in Change Magazine, 1995, by Robert Barr and John Tagg, who had, the title was something like, From Teaching to Learning, A New Paradigm for Undergraduate Education. And even though that was something like, 20 years ago or so, it still turned on its head the fact that in higher ed, we think about teaching and instruction. And in fact, our whole budget model is based on courses and number of students and so forth. And it's not about the learning. If we turned our institutions into learning institutions, we would not focus so much on, well, is it an online course? Is it a MOOC? Is it a classroom? Is there, et cetera? Because those are all elements of pedagogy which are meant to help promote and foster learning. And as both Dan and Randy have talked about, disaggregating, reductionizing, having a reductionist attitude about learning also is not helpful either. But the notion of being able to take learning and make it and conceptualize it in both a holistic as well as in its elemental pieces are important. So what I have to say to you is that having left San Jose, I went to another campus, Dominguez Hills. And you may not probably know this, but Dominguez Hills has a very unique and historic mission. And it's important to hear this story just briefly. And that is that it was actually founded by the Board of Trustees and the governor, who was at that time Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown. And Pat Brown essentially created and founded the university in 1960. And at that time, the university was not even called Cal State Dominguez Hills. In fact, it did not even exist in where it currently sits. It was California State College Palos Verdes. If you've ever heard of Palos Verdes, 55 years ago, it was arguably one of the most 100 affluent cities in the nation. And it was envisioned to be sort of the Harvard of the West, a liberal arts small college situated on the bluffs overlooking the beautiful Pacific Ocean. Students there were not only to have one major, but two majors, a second experimental major. Remember, this is the 1960s. And so I've read these documents, it's fascinating. But at any rate, 5 years, they started the first classes and hired the president around 62. And then in 65, a momentous historic event happened, and that was the first Watts Rebellion. Lasted for 5 days in August 1965. So we just celebrated and commemorated its 50th anniversary in a year-long series of events on our campus. So our campus was physically moved. Pat Brown, the National Guard, and others flew down to Watts and looked at the damage and understood that these are communities in great distress. And they wisely decided you could not move the next CSU into the most affluent neighborhood in Los Angeles, and instead moved it to Carson. Now notice we're not called California State University Carson, because they called it Dominguez Hills, which is actually not a city. It's not a place. Dominguez was referring to a wealthy Mexican landowner at the time, and they added the word hills, perhaps to make it sound more elite, Beverly Hills, you know. So it moved there, and it was supposed to be a institution of higher education that would be a catalyst for transformation and change for communities in need. And indeed, we have done so. So my university is now currently one of the most diverse in California, if not the nation. 89% of our students are students of color. And of that, something like 60% are Hispanic, 58%, about 14% African American, about 10% Asian, and about 11% white. But even, here's the interesting thing, it's not only are we the most diverse, but we also have the highest characteristics of more at-risk students. That is, we have 72% of our students are Pell eligible. I'm sure no one in this audience has students in that range. 75% have remedial needs, and 61% are first gen. So we have a very, very vibrant population of students who come from underserved neighborhoods. So the question is, what do MOOCs and online education have to do with educating students from this demographic? And what I would say to you, again, as the provost there, I've been there now 2.5 years, we have moved the needle dramatically, and that is because we are focusing not so much on the pedagogy, but on what factors improve student retention, student learning, and we are finding that it is a combination of both what happens in the classroom, because that's in fact where professors engage students in the active co-creation of knowledge, but it is also, you have to pay attention to the whole person. And so I think Randy alluded to this a little bit, even Chancellor Dirks talked about it last night, that we must consider non-academic factors, co-curricular factors, but non-academic factors that have influenced students' academic success. And these are things like the sense of belonging, growth mindset, both things that come out of Stanford currently from Carol Dweck, Greg Walton, Jeffrey Cohen already. We have, and you have something here at Stanford which we have just joined. It's the CTC, the College Transitions Collaborative. It is a highly selective process. We are engaged with that now to help our students feel more connected, particularly if you're first generation. You don't necessarily feel connected to your institution unless you change the environment in ways that are more welcoming and inclusive. So I encourage you to look up the CTC. And finally, I'd like to say that when you think about learning, and I am a cognitive developmental psychologist, and a number of us here are cognitive scientists, is that if you think about informal learning, as Randy says, there's informal learning in the sense that as an infant through to the time that you enter formal kindergarten, formal schooling, enormous amount of learning is taking place in what we would call informal environments. So here's the sort of interesting irony as well, for me as a developmentalist, is that there is, of course, a very famous writer, researcher, Lev Vygotsky. Some of you may know him. And so in 1934, he talked about the critical importance of watching children, infants and preschoolers, learning within the absence of a formal school, and noticing that learning takes place when there is meaningful activity that is practical. So infants are trying to learn practical skills that is meaningful. So there's a great deal of motivation and initiative associated with that. And that level of learning is made possible when it is also paired with instruction, with the availability of instruction, which could be peers, but it could also be adults, parents, etc. And that all of that happens within a cultural context. So here it is, some 82 years later, and as people, administrators, faculty, and others in higher ed, it might be time to revisit that notion that learning is not an isolated kind of activity. It is one that within a social milieu. It is one that is also impacted by powerful belief systems about one's own ability, growth mindset, sense of belonging, that also are mediating the success and performance of students. So I think the point of the MOOCs is important insofar as it elevates the discussion and the attention and saliency of teaching, but we must bring in the component of learning and also incorporate the ideas that affect all students, and especially students from underserved communities, that influence their academic performance.
Great, thank you. It's great to have you here. Brian?
I'm mindful as I'm looking out at the audience that each of us are occupying very different places in the ecosystem of higher education. And partly what several of my colleagues here have indicated is the utility, the role, the power of being more self-conscious about that and really thinking deeply about when we talk about learning the students, to be conscious of which students learning what. And with that sort of in my mind, and again, aware of the room, so to speak, and without unnecessarily echoing my colleagues' appreciation that I'm here. My college is about 10 miles from here, those of you who are not Californians. It's a large 23,000 student public community college, largely immigrant, largely poor first generation. And if I look at this conversation from the perspective of my students, I'm forced not to go initially granularly, but actually back up and say, what's the context? So I want to talk a little bit about that and see if I can bring it back to some granularity. I want to look at the broader narrative about higher education. I very much appreciate the initial comments about the two narratives of distributive and integrative. I got a little note at the end. I'll come back to that, which will symmetrically wrap us together. It'd be cool. But I really want to talk about that narrative because I think it affects each of us in each of our institutions, but affects us profoundly differently, where we are in the spectrum of privilege and access. I think the dominant narrative is economist, reductionist, functionalist. Higher education is an economic input. If not a driver, it's a source of innovation, a source of skilled talent. I think that narrative, which has become dominant in the country and is bipartisan in its origin, has as a derivative and a corollary a relentless vocationalism. That our students mostly seek or ought to seek the skills and preparation that get them ready for entry into, participation in, benefit from, profit from the economy of rapid change, techno-driven, all the stuff with which we are all familiar. So if you step back from that narrative, you're forced to kind of ask the point, and particularly forced to ask the point if your students are dominantly poor and from marginalized communities. What's the point? Is the point simply and only access to that? To which you would have to step back from the political economy of the United States and say, how are we doing? We've been real successful about that? I don't think so. There's another way of looking at it, which is if you step further back and ask, what are the dominant issues that will drive the students' lives over the next 50 to 70 years? What issues, beyond getting a job, will dominate their lives? Those are the issues of dramatic and definitive climate change, profound and structural inequality, the rise of fundamentalist rage and violence, deep demographic dislocations worldwide. Those are the issues that will dominate the lives of our students, regardless of which institution we're in. And in the United States, it's happening during a dramatic and profound demographic transition from a majority white to majority non-white nation. In 2042, the United States is majority non-white. Happens sometimes in March of 2042. California is now majority non-white, and more than 50% of our school children are Latino. And again, if you step back and sort of ask, how are we doing with that? This is plainly terrifying a significant percentage of our people who look for magical solutions, are dissociated, alienated, and confused. So again, if I think about my students and your students in that context, what I've got to then ask myself is, what are they going to need to address those issues? The market will not solve them. Engineers will not solve these problems. Our students will need to engage politics, public policy, state power, and they will have to engage each other. They will have to learn the skills of political work. They will have to build coalitions. They will have to speak across difference. They will have to come to points of compassion and generosity. So my begging of the day is that when we're thinking about learning outcomes and assessment of outcomes, to be asking ourselves which outcomes, which learnings, with what purpose? Because entirely too much of the conversation is as if we would be agnostic on those questions. Whatever it is the students want to learn, we want to assess what it is they learn. I think that's irresponsible. Whether we're a private institution or a public institution, I believe we are called to ask the degree to which our students, themselves driven by these narratives, what, 28% of Stanford students want to be in CS? And you're not a vocational school. Look at my students who are desperate to get in on this. And their living experience is not much. Access is hard, difficult. We're transferring 3,000 students a year to universities. And the question is how well they do, how successful they are. We've got to ask the other question, successful in what, towards what end, right? And the thing that I am proud to say, and I think needs to be brought into the conversation, is we can learn a hell of a lot from them. You walk onto my campus, you will see conversations between persons so different from one another, you could not imagine they could talk to each other. They are building forms of community and calling it familia. They are doing research on the use of social media to sustain friendship. They are trying their damnedest to figure out how to use these technologies to build integrative platforms in the face of a constant draw to the contrary. Segregate, disaggregate, dissociate. So I guess the plea I have for today is to give some thought about the way in which these technologies lead to integration. Don't just facilitate access, throughput, and economy, but perhaps advantage inefficiency. We actually enjoy the fact that our students take more than 2 years to complete our programs. 85% of the students at my campus come without college-level mathematics or English compositional skills. It's going to take them longer than 2 years to get to transfer. 72% of them are fluently bilingual. These are competent, smart, committed young people, raising families, working, driving an hour and a half across the valley to get to our campus. So I'm not looking at them through what they don't have. I'm looking at them through what they've got. And then the question is how all of this technology research can facilitate their emergence. And the final thing is a note, it's sort of anecdotal and snarky at some level, I'm sorry. I think we all need to be more mindful about the degree to which we ourselves replicate this thing, right? I'm looking at the audience, and too many of us look like me. You know, it's like, how can we have these conversations? We have got to have these conversations that include who we're talking about. Just honestly, we do. And secondly, I was thinking about this, John, and trust me, it's not on you. I know how these things work logistically. When we have a faculty meeting now, or we have a conversation at DeAnza, we begin with a process called conocimiento. We don't sit in rows, we talk to each other. And we begin with the narrative of personal life. Who am I? What do I care about? What do I bring to this thing? And it entirely changes the feel of the place. It really does. So my proposal for the next one of our meetings as we start that way is you take this marvelously talented group of people and not duplicate the lecture format, which we just did, but instead talk to each other. I mean, I learned from, my colleague at Yale last night things I didn't know about what was happening there, and that was important to me. So that's my plea, is that we spend the day talking about these marvelous things, but we do so in the context of reminding ourselves what the point is. And if the point is only Silicon Valley's economy, 70% of America's venture capital is invested within 20 miles of my campus, and it could be the other side of Mars. So let's give some thought to how we can move to a space where our students are part of a progressive coalition that fights for social justice, that wants peace, and can, I think, help us build integrative communities. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Wow. That was fantastic. Who's going to publish that?
Always tough to follow Brian. Does someone have a question we have questions for each other here? Anything come up in the discussion you'd like to follow up on? Ellen, you mentioned President Obama. So I'm wondering whether you have thoughts about the visibility of issues around higher education in politics this year, which is different from many of the past political discussions about education. Any thoughts on that?
Well, Ted Mitchell is going to be following this panel, so we can hear directly from the source, the administration at the federal level. But I think what I would say is setting goals is always an important first step in making progress. But secondarily, I think what's key in that is understanding how to create the environment and the context for greater change, whether it be budgetary, or whether it start to look at the issues that Brian alluded to. To what extent is an education going to be helpful? And what Brian has articulated so eloquently and powerfully, I think, this morning is to say, when students graduate, particularly from communities of need, how do we help mobilize them so they have the skill sets and the knowledge and the metacognition to really move their communities and their futures ahead? Because just having a BA in and of itself it's just not a sheepskin. It ought to mean something, not just for professional career success or personal satisfaction, but to improve the greater good. And so from the standpoint that the federal government and Obama and others are discussing that, I encourage that we broaden that discussion to include the concepts of social justice, particularly in the face of all the angst that's happening around the elections and the value system that America stands for.
We have a few minutes. We could take questions from those of you sitting in rows, as Brian pointed out.
I'm Jennifer Summit. I was privileged to be a faculty member here at Stanford for 20 years in the English department. I was also privileged to be an ACE fellow at San Jose State, where Junn was my mentor, and now I'm immensely privileged to be the Dean of Undergraduate Education at San Francisco State up the road. Thank you so much for a really stimulating panel and such a rich combination of insights and perspectives. As I'm hearing you and I'm listening to the themes emerging about, Randy, your important point about the conflict between the disaggregating tendency or the unbundling tendency, but also the need for integration to give meaning to the undergraduate experience. I'm also struck by a tension, or I wonder if you experience this as a tension, between the collaborative experience that I hear going on at Berkeley, I think to great effect, but also the personal drive that and personal journey of education that, Randy, you're describing, and I know really working to achieve at Georgetown. The collaborative educational experience is so important to our students' understanding of their place in the world, yet there can also be a standardization in that, creating an education that fosters collaboration because everyone has to be on the same page. Whereas, or I don't know if this is a whereas, this is my question, is there a tension here? That personal, individual journey of education is going to be different for every student. And so I'm wondering how, maybe a glimmer of a response is in Brian, the narrative that you gave us about students of difference coming together across their differences to create productive dialogues. I'm wondering if you could talk about that tension between the personal journey that's central to education, but also the collaborative experience that I think is increasingly important in higher education.
Great, thanks for the question. Randy, do you want to
Well,
comment?
I'll just say a word or two about that. It's obviously an enormously complicated question. I think one of the things that Don Harward, who's president emeritus of Bates and done a lot of great work on civic engagement, he always talks about learning is fundamentally relational. So the personal journey is always about moving through yourself and outward to other people. So in that sense, I don't see it as a conflict at all. I do think that one of the shifts that we need to engage, and I think we heard it going on in the Berkeley program, we see it in all of our institutions, is that some of the paradigms, the pedagogical paradigms that will shape the post-MOOC online era is to not look to face-to-face teaching and learning as the source of those models, but to actually look to what are some of the models of learning and community that are native to the web that we can appropriate for really powerful educational ends. And in fact, we may not be able to even achieve a level of engagement at scale without adopting native web-based pedagogies that are fundamentally social and communal and networked. And I think that's actually one of the most promising ways to negotiate that tension.
Just let me grab that to make one other point, which is to sort of appropriate your question in a slightly different direction, which is to say we as institutions have that tension. In other words, each of us on our own bottom trying to figure this out. In this region of incredible educational diversity, we have, I think, a pretty rare opportunity to work collaboratively across very great differences of institutional structure and form and purpose and status and all the rest of it. I'm sitting here listening to the stuff you were talking about learning. I'm over here trying to take notes and saying, how do I get a hold of him? And in other words, there's this incredible work going on that we should be doing together. Yeah. And I think this region gives us a rare opportunity, as would Southern California, as would lots of other places in the country, for us to be much more collaborative around discernment in these pedagogies, learnings, purposes, and at the same time be very mindful of difference, appreciative of it, and learn from it.
Yeah, I just want to sort of plug those two together a bit. I mean, what Randy said is true. The web actually allows us to cross these boundaries, even if we're not geographically situated. Of course, it doesn't necessarily, we don't do it on our own, but that's something that we should be doing. We don't have to drive. I don't have to drive to DeAnza College.
Actually, we do, but that's okay.
Well, but I mean, to put my students in touch with your students, it does not require dealing with 101 every day. Right? I mean, one of the things that the web could do, and I don't think it does it particularly well now, it polarizes us, it allows us to go back into our comfort zone. But we could be using it and directing it to sort of overcome some of our class and social boundaries that our institutions are sort of reproducing. So it would be worth thinking about what it is about this technology. I mean, in the classrooms that we have, the students, they are talking to students in other countries and in very different backgrounds. I think we could really self-consciously use the technology to its benefit to start to have conversations across, all of the race, gender, class boundaries that we should be concerned about.
Dan, would you like me to put you on the spot? Or?
Well, I was going to give a smaller answer to the question. So there was a great study that we did here on MOOC where it was an international level MOOC, and we chose people in their discussion groups, in their forum, whether they were from diverse nations or not. And it turns out the groups that had the diverse nations represented in the forum, they were more persistent, they had deeper conversations, they learned about one another more, and they recognized what made themselves unique. Yeah. So it's not obvious that these two things need to be a tension. There's a way to sort of make them a strength.
Good. Another thought? Someone have something cross their mind? Yes, you.
Kai Dreckmeyer from Inside Track. Couple of great ideas here. I do want to focus on teaching and learning. Given the deep understanding and expertise you have around cognition, teaching and learning, what's the mechanism for getting that into every classroom here at Stanford, but also anywhere or in K-12? My kids are in the Oakland School District, public schools, and there's some great teaching, but there is sort of a scarcity, I think, K-12, community college, university, of this sort of excellence, and how do we get it out there? Or that's for anyone.
Yeah, that's sort of the million-dollar question
Small
on
question
translation.
there, right?
So a lot of people seem to think through the technology we can sort of make a pill. The technology is sort of a pill, and we send it to everybody, and they take it, and then they'll learn. So I've got a math app, get it in. So that's not working very well, but largely because the market's cluttered. People can't find stuff, and there's no good way to evaluate it. And if you want to get your technology evaluated, you pay money to a company that then gives it an award. So there's some structural problems there. The one thought that we're starting to explore is to get universities to partnership with, say, school districts. So there's an opportunity to actually get these groups together in kind of a win-win where there is some diffusion of expertise, but also a responsiveness to the kinds of challenges that school districts do. So it's a little more high touch than just distributing it on the web. But I think that may be one way to do this. And so we're partnered with San Francisco Unified. You could imagine UC Davis could partner with Sacramento. That may be another way to do it. But this is the big challenge. How do you disseminate this?
Great. Take one more. Rob?
Rob Blue, Harvard X and the Bach Center for Teaching and Learning. I think all of you have spoken compellingly to the fact that there may be a false dichotomy in between how we think about what happens in a highly integrated in-person sort of learning experience and what happens online. And I think we've all grown incredibly tired of this notion of how online will disrupt the in-person. My question to all of you is, how do you think we can now use what we're learning profoundly about the in-person to actually disrupt what has been a largely sort of traditional view of what online education can do?
Great final question. Any thoughts on that?
To me, part of the shift has to be from thinking about the power of the whole bundle to the whole person. To be asking at every level, what does it mean to think about the development of the whole individual from the beginning of that educational journey? And to me, the conflict isn't at all between face-to-face and online. It's really about what it is you're asking to produce or cultivate along that journey. So, there's many nuances to that, but it's just where is our focus? And it has to do with what you think the aims of education are. And those are directly related to who it is that you see that you have at the very beginning of the journey, not at the end of the journey.
I guess part of what I saw in your question related to Dan's comment, that in the MOOC Flash, we took perhaps our least effective and least inspiring format from campus and scaled that. So another idea is, as we move forward in thinking about campus and residential education and things we would do in person, can we take good ideas that arise in that way and think about using them as the basis for different kinds of technology-hosted activities? Do you have another thought on that?
No, I think it's a good idea. So there's sort of one approach, which is you sort of go into the forest and you find which plants seem to be medicinal. Mm-hmm. And then you bring them in the lab and you condense them, and suddenly you've got something very successful. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of lessons from the informal environment like that. And the interesting thing that shows up in the informal is kind of all the non-academic stuff. Mm-hmm. So interests, passions, identity, self-concept, friendship, sort of been ignored in the press to the textbook model. And so I think being able to figure out how to get some of that into the regular classroom, maybe it'll fit, maybe classroom environment just isn't designed for that sort of learning, but it may. And then you could really enrich things and achieve a lot of the normative aims that I hear people saying, about what they think the goal of education should be.
Well, and vice versa. In the online context, our students, unbeknownst to us, create all these clubs, these social identity sort of based clubs, and the networks that we didn't form, they just create them themselves because they want to get to know one another as bigger people than simply people they see in the classroom. So I think it goes both ways.
Ellen, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I'd like to add that you can attack this question both from a philosophical 20,000 foot view as well as down on the ground, and that is to say, if you're really going to make a change, instead of just thinking of degree programs as atomized courses, there's a course in X and Y and Z, that and this is where the faculty become critical, is having the faculty decide what are those key goals in the larger learning environment, not just the course competencies that are the reductionist piece, but what should this student be able to accomplish once they have attained the degree. So there's that level of planning and I think overall, overarching philosophy that the department, the college, the university ought to play a role in. And then secondarily, how do you instantiate that at the course level? Now here again, one of the things that I think from a pragmatic point of view, one of the things that we've been doing at our campus is to meet with departments and say to the departments, which courses, are these courses the right courses? And how are you, as Brian says, how are you measuring? What are your learning outcomes? What are your goals? And then how do you modify the pedagogies? Some courses are going to be more aptly adjusted to online kinds of formats. Certainly for students on our campus who are working 2, 3, sometimes jobs and have families, as Brian says. My students don't want online experiences. This is, for them, college is a new idea. They want the sense of community, sense of belonging, connection with professors, but they also have very complicated, busy lives, driving through LA traffic, so having some opportunity to make use of some hybrid or online formats is appealing to them, but they have to be designed of very high quality, and that's the difficult piece. But I think to the extent that you get faculty truly, as Brian says, understanding what is important to you for your students in their final outcome, helps them be more conscious and intentional in how you design your courses, how you design your curriculum, and how you can measure those learning outcomes in a way that makes sense for our students.
Great. Shall we leave it there? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I want to thank our plenarists for a wonderful, really interesting, inspiring session.
Thank you.